Good morning, class. Today, we will be learning about the 5 elements of ancient Greece. After today's presentation, students should be able to identify the 5 elements of ancient Greece. Students should also be able to identify the different theories the ancient Greek philosophers had about the basic elements in nature. So let's get started. Have you ever tried to come up with an answer to the question no one had a definite answer to? Questions like, how many universes are there? What's on the other side of the black hole? Why do humans dream? How does gravity work? Well, you are not alone. Throughout human existence, humans have always wondered about the world around them. For example, during the ancient Greeks, philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, Thales, Xenophanes, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, and Empedocles had their own answer to the question, what is the basic element which all things are made out of? Some of these philosophers agreed that there were indeed 5 elements that were the basic elements of all things in nature, and others believed that there was only one. Others believed that there was only 2. During the presentation, we will explore each philosopher's answer to the question, what is the basic element which all things are made out of? And like I mentioned, a great number of ancient Greek philosophers tried to come up with the answer to the questions. There were some Greek philosophers that believed there was only one basic element which all things were made out of. For example, Anaximenes believed air was the one basic element. Heraclitus believed fire was the one basic element. Thales believed that water was the one basic element. And Xenophanes believed earth and water were the basic elements to all things in nature. The philosopher Anaximenes believed air was a basic element to all things. He was actually the first philosopher to explain the emergence of air based on the features of air through ratification and condensation. According to Anaximenes, when air ratifies, mist and rain emerge. And when air condenses, rock and earth emerge. And this probably sounds funny, but his conclusion made a lot of sense back in the ancient Greeks. Now let's explore Thales, the philosopher Thales. So the Greek philosopher Thales explained his theory that water was the basic element of all things by analyzing the biological principles of water. He believed because all living things required water to survive, then that must mean that water was the basic element of all things. He also thought that because there was moisture in a seed, that water was the basic element of all things. He also believed that water was the basic element to all things because heat in the form of sun and moon is generated out of moisture and kept alive by water. If you notice, each philosopher has their own evidence to back up their theory. Heraclitus, for example, used logic to support his theory about fire being the basic element of all things. He believed change is one thing that remains the same, and he also believed that change makes all things one. He believed that fire is the symbol of change, and he believed so because fire destroys things and rekindles things. Something perishes in the fire, and something emerges from the fire. This actually makes a lot of sense. Now we know that obviously fire is not the basic element of all things in nature, but this probably made a lot of sense back in the ancient Greeks. Empedocles also used logic. However, Empedocles was the first ancient Greek philosopher to suggest that air, water, fire, and earth were the base elements of all things in nature. He referred to the elements as roots. He actually conducted an experiment to prove his point. Empedocles actually set light to a stick. And while this might not seem like the most groundbreaking scientific research ever made, it did convince many philosophers of the time that fire was indeed, that those four elements were indeed the basic elements of all things in nature. After his experiment, he was able to conclude that the four elements were indeed the four elements which all things were made out of. He said, well, since the stick burned, it obviously contains fire. And because the burnt stick left behind dirt-like residue, then he concluded that the stick also contained earth. He noticed that the residue felt a bit damp, which he then used to conclude that water must be present. And because the burning stick gave off smoke, he was able to conclude that air was also present. I conducted the experiment myself. During the experiment, you will observe the different things that Empedocles observed during his experiment. Instead of a stick, I used a leaf, and I used a lighter to set the leaf on fire, which is funny because lighters were not invented back in ancient Greece. So let's just pretend that I didn't do that. Let's just observe what is happening. So just like the stick is burning, the leaf is also burning, which we can suggest that because the leaf is burning, there is fire present. There is also smoke emerging from the burning leaf, which we can also use to conclude that air is present. And after the leaf is burnt, we can also notice that there is a dirt-like residue left behind, which is ash, which we can use to conclude that ash, there is earth present because there is ash. And the ash had a damp feeling to it, which we can also use to conclude that there is water present. Of course, today this can be negated because now there's more advanced research. But back then, this is the only type of evidence philosophers like Empedocles had about their theories. The philosopher Plato was the first ancient Greek philosopher to theorize that the 5 basic elements of all things in nature were made out of regular solids. He named them the Platonic solids. He also came up with the 5th element, ether. So Plato believed that the tetrahedron solid represented fire. He believed that the solid icosahedron represented water. He believed that the solid cube represented earth, and he also believed that the octahedron represented air. And lastly, he believed that a dodecahedron represented ether. His student Aristotle also agreed that there were 5 elements that composed all things in nature. However, he believed that the universe was divided into 2 parts, the terrestrial region and the celestial region. Aristotle was the first ancient Greek philosopher to give the 5 elements characteristics. He classified the elements on whether they were hot or cold, or wet or dry. He believed fire, earth, air, and water, and of all things in terrestrial regions. He believed ether made of all things in the celestial region. He believed that fire was dry and wet, earth was dry and cold, air was wet and hot, water was wet and cold, and ether was neither hot, cold, and neither wet or dry. So let's review. Today we learned about the 5 elements of ancient Greece. We learned that there is water, air, earth, fire, and ether. We learned that those are the 5 elements of ancient Greece, which the Greeks thought were the basic elements of all things in nature. Each ancient Greek philosopher tried to come up with the answer to the question, and every philosopher had a different answer to the question. For example, Anaximenes believed that air was the one basic element. Heraclitus believed fire was the one basic element. Thales believed water was the one basic element. Xenophanes believed earth and water were the basic elements of all things in nature. Empedocles was the first ancient Greek philosopher to suggest that air, fire, water, and earth were the basic elements of all things around us. He referred to the elements as roots, and he conducted an experiment to prove his point. Plato was the first Greek philosopher to theorize that the 5 basic elements of all things in nature were made out of regular solids. He named them the Platonic solids. Plato's student Aristotle believed that the universe was divided into 2 parts, the terrestrial region and the celestial region. Aristotle was the first ancient Greek philosopher to give the 5 elements characteristics. He classified the elements on whether they were hot or cold or dry. He believed that fire was dry and wet, earth was dry and cold, air was wet and hot, water was wet and cold, and ether was neither hot, cold, or wet or dry. I hope you guys enjoyed the lecture. Have an amazing rest of the day. Bye.